Okay, maybe we'll go ahead and get started. We just finished an hour-and-a-half executive session, and I see we have a pretty small audience at this point. But we'll go ahead and run through our introduction. My name is Darrell Boness. I'm the chairman of the commission, and the commission meets annually with its committee of scientific advisors, and our goal is to try and move around different regions based on priorities of activities and issues in a given area. It so happens, though, that we've not been to this region for over a decade, so we're glad to be here. Before I kind of get into summarizing our meeting and what it's about and sort of our rationale for having the meeting here, we will introduce people at the, have people at the front table, which are the commissioners, committee of scientific advisors and staff, introduce themselves, although I think many of you in the audience that I see know who we are, but it will put in the record, since we are recording the meeting, who's in attendance. But before I go around the table, I'd just like to note that this has been a rather unusual year for the commission in terms of staff turnover. The commission has had 3 individuals move on. One was our executive director, Dr. Rebecca Lent, who moved for a good cause. She's become the Secretary General of the International Whaling Commission. So while she's moved on, we still interact with her a fair amount. Our senior policy analyst, David Laced, retired after almost 40 years, or maybe even a bit over. But so David will be hard to replace. He had a lot of history with the commission, covered a lot of ground. And then our communications specialist, who also did sort of legislative affairs congressional liaison for us, has moved to the Northeast Fisheries Science Center with NOAA. So we have new people, or new, not so much new people, new individuals in new positions. So it turns out that we have hired Peter Thomas, who's sitting here at the front table. I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, know Peter. Peter had been with the commission for 8 years before becoming our executive director. He was our international affairs and policy director. And Peter has had a long history in environmental diplomacy and conservation policy, working at State Department and Fish and Wildlife Service before coming to the commission. So we're extremely pleased to have Peter stepping in, hit the ground running, which was extremely important for reasons that we'll talk about a little bit later in this introduction. We also have been making an effort to focus more and more on fisheries issues. And in doing so, Dennis Heineman, who was our director of science, has agreed to shift his focus to fisheries issues, but also sort of ecosystem science. So Dennis is now in that position, focusing on bycatch and entanglement in particular, but all sorts of issues. And Dennis also has taken on dealing with take reduction teams. So, of course, that then left an opening for our science leader, and after announcement and advertisement, we selected Dr. Samantha Simmons, who also has been with the commission for, I believe, 7 years, and was part of our science team. So Sam is now our Scientific Program Director, and we're very pleased to have Sam in that position. So we played a bit of musical chairs, but as a result, we still have some positions as individuals moved out of positions that need to be backfilled, and we are in the process of advertising right now for our Communications Legislative Affair position, and what's our second one? Yes, David Lace's position, which is a policy analyst, although David, having been there as long as he had been, was very senior analyst. We're looking for someone at a lower level in that position. So if you know individuals, the job announcements are out for both of those positions. Please feel free to recommend them looking at those job announcements. Okay, two other individuals that one is new to the commission. The commission has had over a number of years now has been successful in attracting CNOS fellows, which come to us through the Sea Grant program and are with us for a year or slightly more than a year, I think, for at least some individuals. And we've been really fortunate in that we get incredibly talented people in those positions. And our current CNOS fellow, who started with us in February, is Brady O'Donnell. And Brady has stepped in the absence of currently having a communications and legislative affairs person, has stepped in and has taken on that role extremely well for us. And then we also have Jenna Malik, who was a previous CNOS fellow, I guess 3 years ago now. She did a year after being with us with NIMS headquarters. Jenna and Vicki Cornish had put together a grant proposal with North Pacific Research Board, and you'll hear a bit more about this from Peter in a few minutes. But so Jenna is back with us as a contractor on that grant that the commission got to do some co-management work. So we're pleased to have them with us as well. So let me kind of just turn to the meeting here over the next 3 days. As I said, it is our first meeting in the Pacific Northwest in over a decade. And in it being so long, we clearly need to be updated on some of the important issues. There are clearly two important issues that are on our agenda, are the status of the southern resident killer whales and the growing pinniped population. And interestingly, both of those issues tie into endangered and threatened salmon stocks. We'll be hearing a lot about that over the next next 2 days, I guess. In our last 2 years or 3 years of meetings, we've been very focused on one or two issues. While we do have these two issues I just mentioned that are real priorities for us to be updated on and be able to discuss, be able to discuss with our Committee of Scientific Advisors during the discussion periods. We also felt that we ought to take advantage of being here in Seattle, where there are researchers at the Marine Mammal Lab and also researchers at the university who are doing marine mammal science research that we really want to hear about the latest and greatest. So our meeting will also have some focus on Arctic and Alaska issues, and particularly from a research perspective. And then lastly, some of the issues that pertain to the Pacific Northwest are broader than just the Pacific Northwest, such as large whale entanglements. In fact, more entanglements, as you all know, are occurring in California than here, though there are some here. And then also sea otters. We're very much interested in sea otters from the perspective of Alaska, Pacific Northwest, and California. So we will cover those in a broader capacity. So we have a really packed agenda. Commission meetings in the past were very broad and covered a lot of issues. They also ended up running over into very long hours. We don't want to do that, but we do want to give justice to the issues we have selected. So we look forward to the next 3 days. Let me just perhaps finish my kind of introduction to the meeting with, there is one issue that you might ask yourself, why isn't it on the agenda? And that's an issue that has to do with the Macaw tribe seeking authorization under the MMPA to take gray whales for subsistence and cultural reasons. And it was deliberate on our part not to include it in the meeting, not because we're disinterested in it or think it is unimportant, but rather because the process of this is ongoing, and it requires a formal adjudicatory rulemaking, and we didn't think it was appropriate for us to have a discussion on this at this meeting. We are, however, satisfying our Section 103A of the MMPA and consulting with the National Marine Fisheries Service on this, and we expect that, or we expect that there may be a rule published within the next year. So we're very much paying attention to that, though we're not having it as part of our meeting here. So let me kind of, well, I guess before I move on to the next bit, let's quickly do give your name, your affiliation with the commission, and your affiliation outside of the commission. And let's start with Peter.
Hi, I'm Peter Thomas, Executive Director.
Randy Wells, Scientific Advisor with the Chicago Zoological Society.
Patricia Roselle, Scientific Advisor and NOAA Fisheries.
Vera Metcalf, Special Advisor on Native Affairs. I live in Nome.
Sue Moore, Scientific Advisor and NOAA Fisheries.
Robert Sedam, Scientific Advisor, and I work with the North Slope Borough.
Mike Tillman, Commissioner, and I'm a Research Associate with Scripps Institution of Oceanography.
Frances Gulland, Commissioner and Veterinarian at the Marine Mammal Center.
Scientific Advisors, Committee of Scientific Advisors and private consultant.
Aaron Thode, Scientific Committee with the Scripps Institution of Oceanography.
Samantha Strindberg, Scientific Committee and Wildlife Statistician with the Wildlife Conservation Society.
Jason Baker, Committee of Scientific Advisors and National Marine Fisheries Service.
Robin Baird, Committee of Scientific Advisors and Cascadia Research Collective.
Tiff Brookins, biologist on staff at the Commission.
Brady O'Donnell, the Knaus Fellow of 2018.
Jenna Malik, Co-Management Fellow.
Dennis Heineman, Staff, Senior Advisor for Fisheries and Ecosystems.
Mike Goslinger, and I'm the Commission's General Counsel.
I'm Dee Allen, the Research Program Officer, Commission staff.
Samantha Simmons, Scientific Program Director and Research Associate with the University of California in Santa Cruz. And we have one additional staff member on the webinar, Vicki.
This is Vicki Cornish. I'm the Energy Policy Analyst for the Commission. Thank you.
And Daryl Jordan, Staff Assistant at the Commission.
Yeah, just to let you know, we are doing this as a webinar as well, and some of our presentations, I believe, will also be given remotely, and Vicki is remotely participating in the meeting as well. So probably most of you in the audience are aware of this past year having been a difficult situation, not only in terms of staff turnover, but in terms of the Commission's long-term being, in that the current administration's budget in FY18 was asking us to provide a shutdown budget for the Commission to be shut down. We received an incredibly strong response from the general public, NGOs, and there was a strong response from Congress with letters going from both the House and the Senate to the Appropriations Committees in support of what the Commission has been doing in the past. And as a result, in FY18, the Commission did receive a budget in both the House and Senate. And in fact, we were funded at our FY17 level. And indeed, that is our funding. That's been our funding level since FY14. So we're slowly losing ground with a flat level budget, but it's good for us that we are indeed funded for this next year. However, we're also now in the same situation with regard to FY19. The administration has us with a shutdown budget. We got a very rapid response once the President's budget was announced, again from the general public, and again letters that went both from congressmen, congresspersons, and senators signing on to a letter that went to the Appropriations Committee. So we're hopeful that what happened in FY18 will happen again in FY19, but that process is still ongoing. So we continue to operate with a certain degree of uncertainty, and I fear that this will probably be the case for the next 2 years, but we'll wait and see. So I guess with that update on budget, maybe I'll turn it over to Peter to kind of give you a summary of things that the Commission has been doing over the past year and will be doing this year.
Thanks, Daryl, and welcome everybody. We just wanted to give you a really brief, aside from the Pacific Northwest and Alaska and the Arctic, a brief overview of other things we've been working on over the past year to really give you the impression that even though we are a little bit under the gun, we're still working hard and there's a lot to work on. And again, it's a small staff and a very dedicated committee of scientific advisors and fantastic commissioners who really push us forward in this work. So thanks to them in advance. So I'll just run through fairly quickly. I have 11 minutes and 46 seconds to do this. I think one of the things we've been paying the most attention to is really congressional and administration interest in the Marine Mammal Protection Act and possible amendment to it. Just to read a few things, Congress enacted, maybe in February, legislation directing the issuance of an MMPA taking authorization for 3 restoration projects in Louisiana related to the Mississippi River Diversion Project. There are other bills that are focused on streamlining MMPA processes. Some of the proposals relate to amendments related to streamlining incidental take authorizations and procedures, expanding pinniped, we'll talk about this later, expanding take authority for pinnipeds to conserve Columbia River salmonids, allowing importation of previously taken polar bear trophies, this is something that comes up often, and allowing where there's legislation related to authorizing the bowhead hunt in the event that the IWC would fail to adopt catch limits. And finally, and I don't, maybe Mike can talk to this if anyone's interested, the legislation related to preempting states from regulating trade in walrus ivory handicrafts. So there's broad interest in this administration and this Congress on the procedures under the MMPA and how to make things work better and more efficiently. We've also been following Alaskan and Arctic issues. We held our listening sessions in the Arctic in 2016 when we visited Barrow, Kotzebue, Nome, and Anchorage. And that really started or reinvigorated our work with the Indigenous Peoples Council for Marine Mammals, IPCOM. So we've been going regularly to their meetings. Daryl's been going to, I think, all of their meetings, unless there are snowstorms, and keeping track of their agenda and trying to, strengthen the Marine Mammal Commission's role relative to co-management. And in that light, thanks to the work of Jenna and Vicki, the Marine Mammal Commission was awarded a grant from the North Pacific Research Board to conduct a review of co-management, marine mammal co-management in Alaska. And Jenna has moved to Alaska to do that project over the course of this year. Vicki's been going up regularly to meet with her and a steering committee that's been developed for that. And the goal of the study is to look at ways to enhance co-management agreements and improve the relationships between Alaska Native and federal agency co-management partners. And Jenna's here to talk about it. Vicki will be available on the phone to go over the developments. That we also have great stuff on our website on the progress of that, which should be done the end of next January, I think, approximately, when we give recommendations on the improvements we suggest. Mike Tillman has also been busy as the chair of the IWC's Aboriginal Subsistence Whaling Working Group, which has been doing a variety of work prior to the commission meeting this September. They just met in Barrow in April, and I won't go into detail on their agenda because I can't describe it well, but they, I think, have been very successful in front-loading the meeting that's coming up, the commission meeting coming up, and that will really help in the consideration of the bowhead quota issues. Still in Alaska and the Arctic, we went up for our listening sessions in 2016 expecting to talk about climate change and the impacts on subsistence hunting and changes and everything, and we really got kind of a fistful of polar bears. And so the issue of the Alaska Native organizations managing polar bears has been front and center for the last couple of years, and we now have really, I think, good news on the formation of the new Alaska Native organization, the Alaska Nunut with two N's, Co-Management Council for Polar Bears. So that's going ahead. And Daryl and Mike have also served on the bilateral U.S.-Russia bilateral delegations, and there's a meeting coming up somewhere in Russia, which we're trying to figure out if there's either money or transportation to get there later this summer. And as I said, we still follow, and I think the session this morning will really reflect the interest on the changes, whether it's in the Arctic or in the North Pacific, that are coming about with warming temperatures and climate changes. That was an issue then. It's still an issue. It's still affecting communities up there and marine mammals up there. And just this morning there was news that the International Maritime Organization has established shipping lanes through the Bering Straits and corridors down toward Unimak Pass and up north into the Arctic, based on what they described as this spaghetti-like transportation of ships in that region. So now there will be some order put to that. I'm getting there. So another thing that's been big this year we won't go into is the conservation of the vaquita. We've spent time on that at almost every annual meeting since time immemorial. But this year there was a big effort, the Vaquita Conservation Protection and Recovery Program, which sought to find vaquitas, catch them, and bring them into what's termed sanctuary. Francis was a real leader in that. And even as we participated in that, we've been working on alternative gear still, Rebecca really was working hard on economic alternatives for the communities down in the upper Gulf of California. I can't let it pass without saying that we do an immense amount of review of applications for incidental harassment authorization, letters of authorization, environmental NEPA stuff, and then Marine Mammal Protection Act permits. So we review 50 research and enhancement, public display, or photography permit applications on average a year, 60 LOAs or IHAs, and the associated documents. Also Antarctic Conservation Act applications every year, resulting in nearly 120 letters, and there are only a few of these letters that are one page. They're mostly really detailed letters, and amazing work by the staff on those letters. And over the years, those applications have become more numerous and more complex, and the volume of work has pretty much increased. And that's part of why we're trying to hire people at the moment. And then I guess I'd make a comment that with this attention to streamlining in the regulatory agencies, that could lead to a little bit of, hurry up, don't do it quite as well. And that affects our workload as well. There's sort of a lot more work and maybe a little more quality control than at other times. Marine mammal bycatch, of course, is probably the main cause of marine mammal mortality around the world. And this year since our annual meeting last year, focused on North Atlantic right whales. Little did we know that it would be a catastrophic summer up in Canada with 17 deaths, both from ship strike and entanglement. And so we've been following those developments really closely, inserting ourselves where we can. It's a little bit encouraging that NIMPS has a lot going on, a lot of different working groups looking at different levels of the issues before them, but still we're actually looking at Canada and seeing some great developments there, or great responses. It's not good that the whales are dying up there, but really rapid responses that maybe outstrip some of what the U.S. is able to do. Finally, I would want to mention our grants program. In FY17, we funded 10 projects which were directed at populations of marine mammals at extreme risk. There were some for Antillean manatees, Taiwanese humpback dolphins, and North Atlantic right whales. I'm not sure if last year's was the one funding ropeless gear, some of the research on ropeless gear, or that was a previous year. But anyway, we've been in that ropeless gear game for a little while with Marine Mammal Commission funding. And finally, I hope you guys go to our website. We redid the website 2 to 3 years ago. Luis Leandro gets a lot of credit for leading our team who put that together. And we have good participation in the website. We have good social media presence. One lesson we've learned over the years, if you want to tweet, get a high school student. We had a fantastic high school student named Maria who's about to go to the University of California, Santa Barbara to study marine science. But she came in just a couple hours every week and really managed our Twitter content. And there's no better place to go than an 18-year-old for that kind of stuff. And I want to acknowledge Brady for coming in as a Sea Grant Fellow with really no boss where there was supposed to be a boss, and picking up the social media and website stuff. And finally, going back to what Darrell said, we've really been upping our visits up to Capitol Hill, presence with Senate, Congressional, and House offices with our Appropriations committees on both House and Senate are really important. And again, echo that we've gotten great support from the public sector, from NGOs, from industry. Really appreciate that. And then I think we're supposed to wrap up with annual meeting logistics. We've mentioned that the session is being recorded, so when you speak, please speak to the mic and say who you are. It's also on a GoToMeeting, so there are folks on the phone watching the presentations, and I think they're going to weigh in by chatting in. Is that right, Brady? So they'll indicate a question, or I'm not sure if they're going to speak. And some speakers on the last day will be speaking remotely, just a couple. And we also have Vicki on the phone. So Anything else, Daryl? That's good. Go, Gerald.
Yes. Sorry. Just one thing. If you drove to our meeting and parked here, there is a little validation parking, a box for validating your parking on the table outside. You can validate your parking at any time, but you should not pay for your parking until you are exiting the garage. The kiosk down at the end of the hall was out of order yesterday. I don't know if it's working again now. But if you pay for your parking, once you pay, you have 20 minutes to exit the garage or it will start charging you all over again. So just a little detail to let you know that. And it's $20 instead of $45. So.
Well, we're pretty much on time here. Thank you, Peter, for that very concise summary. Just one other point I'll make logistically. Since our main purpose here is to be interacting and discussing issues with our CSA, when it comes time to question session, discussion sessions, we'll give commissioners and committee members first opportunity for comments, questions, and discussion. Then we'll give the audience that's present here an opportunity if time allows. And then we'll also give an opportunity to those who are remotely located and online. So with that, let me run right into our first session. Each year, for the past several years, we've been including presentations on focusing on the ecosystems wherever we're meeting. And today we have our first session on the physical and biological characteristics of the North Pacific. It'll be moderated by Dr. Sue Moore, who is one of our committee members and also senior scientist with NOAA's Office of Science and Technology. Sue, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Daryl. The speakers that will really be carrying the water for this session are joining me now. It is my pleasure to be the moderator for this session. I have long and strong interest in marine ecosystems and especially how marine mammals interact with them. I've been known to call marine mammals sentinels. I'll try to keep that to a minimum. We have three speakers. And the first is Nick Bond. He will be giving really a broad overview of atmospherics and how the physical drivers of the system in the North Pacific work and sometimes surprise us. Then we have two speakers that will be looking at specific systems, the California current system and the Gulf of Alaska, again to try to set the stage for us. They'll be talking about primary production, lower trophic levels, basically bringing us up to marine mammals that we will be discussing the rest of the meeting. So this session is basically to set the stage. I've asked each speaker to try to stop at about 12 or 13 minutes. They have 15 minutes. We will take questions for clarification, but I'm trying to ask everyone to think broadly in this session and hold questions for further discussion to the end. We have 15 minutes. Because I think some of the presentations may inform and give you answers to some of those early questions. So without further ado, Nick Bond, who is also the Washington climate person. So if you have any trouble with the weather while you're here, he's your man.
That's right. Yeah, and just to be precise, I am the Washington State climatologist, but that's okay. So starting off with this cartoon that it was struck by how little it furthered the the understanding of what's been going on in the Northeast Pacific the last couple of years. And also struck by here at the, if you see in the indication of California in the boundary there, as that's maybe the only part of the U.S. West Coast that really matters, right? Maybe so, but anyway, what I really want to go through here in a very summary way is this recent marine heat wave that we've endured in the Northeast Pacific. And first, very superficially, talk a little bit about the main primary modes of variability in the tropical Pacific because they impact our region of interest. A little bit about the event itself in a climate change context. And finally, something that is increasingly of interest to the climate community. Can we predict these kinds of events? So here we go. So El Nino Southern Oscillation. I imagine everybody has heard El Nino, but people are born every day that haven't. And so just very quickly going to go through that, where basically the idea there is that in the tropical Pacific, there's usually colder water in the eastern part, warmer water in the west, asymmetry in the kind of east-west direction. During El Niños, there's warmer water than usual in the central Pacific, and that encourages the development of these large clusters of long-lasting thunderstorms. Just the opposite happens during La Nina, where it's colder than normal in the tropical Pacific, and so there's a lack of thunderstorms there. They're restricted to the far western Pacific. Okay, so we don't live there. Who cares? It turns out that that disruption in the tropical Pacific has a kind of a ripple effect to higher latitudes, and in particular, it has a fairly robust signature on the atmospheric circulation patterns over the North Pacific and Western North America, where it's something broadly akin to if you threw a rock into a pond and the waves that emanate from that. Not exactly the same. But we know about these, and they are, to a certain extent, robust. And in particular, what we see in the ocean is those changes in the atmosphere circulation patterns, plus oceanic processes that basically can communicate what's going on in the tropical Pacific to higher latitudes. We tend to see during El Niños, and this is just an average of the last three, warmer than normal water along the entire west coast of North America. Here's our El Nino itself at the equator. During La Niñas, it's not exactly a mirror image, and these are just the last three of them. Every event has its own individual characteristics, but kind of more or less the opposite sort of thing with cooler than normal waters along much of the west coast of North America and into the Gulf of Alaska and the Bering Sea. Okay, so these kind of El Niños and La Niñas come on I would say, a semi-regular basis. On average, El Niños every 3 to 4 years. It can be as long as 7 years between them. La Nina is kind of the same. For what it's worth, La Niñas often are back-to-back, and El Niños not so much. So that's so they're not exactly the opposite of one another. And then you can also see this time series goes back to 1950. There are periods in which there's kind of maybe a little bit more of La Niñas and periods in which there are more El Niños. And so there's some kind of a slow variability in that system too. All right, so that's the whirlwind tour of El Nino, La Nina, and the Southern Oscillation. Another phenomenon that, again, I bet everybody in this room has at least heard of is the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, or the PDO. And in that case, that's the leading mode of variability of the sea surface temperatures in the North Pacific north of 20 degrees north. It's formally defined that way. In its warm or positive phase, the map of the sea surface temperatures all across the Pacific, including the South Pacific, is shown on the left. On the right is in the cool or negative phase. And an important point is that it's not independent of El Nino and La Nina. there's some interactions there, but it is important because of its temporal character, which is shown in this time series going back to, well, the beginning of the 20th century. And there, what is obvious is there's, relative to El Niños that have higher frequency, there are some really important low frequency character to the PDO, where there are periods here from the 50s through the mid-70s where predominantly negative values and then a period of positive values. What is also kind of interesting, our data isn't so good, but there are periods when there's not that kind of low frequency variability. And then for what it's worth, recently that variability, rather than being on multi-decadal timescales, has been on more like 5, maybe 7-year timescales. But at any rate, the ecosystem is in the Northeast Pacific is clearly impacted by these variations associated with the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. All right, on to our recent marine heat wave, also known as the blob. This is a slide that I ripped off from Toby Garfield at the NOAA Southwest Fisheries Science Center. Got a lot going on here, but there was a lot going on in both the climate system and the ocean in that period of 2014-16. Very warm temperatures in the ocean, you know, a terrible drought in California and more in the ocean, changes in from lower trophic levels to the higher trophic levels, and so a very extreme event. What really got my attention was what was happening in the weather in the winter of 2013-14. And this is a map of the sea level pressure anomalies relative to normal, with the yellows and oranges being above normal pressure. And this is for October through March, a 6-month period in which there was just a really stubborn ridge of higher than normal pressure off our coast that blocked the usual parade of storms in the Pacific Northwest and Gulf of Alaska. Less wind, and the winds from a weird angle meant less heat being drawn out of the ocean. And as a consequence, we got a really warm region that became known as the blob in kind of an unusual sort of pattern. This shows at the end of the 13-14 winter. And so that really got a lot of our attention. What actually turned out in the following 2 winters is that those warm waters were maintained and kind of evolved to a certain extent. Here the colors are showing the sea surface temperature anomalies. This happens to be in early 2016. Those contours and the dashed lines showing lower than normal sea level pressure. What happened is, with this lower than normal pressure and the more winds from the south than usual along the west coast, it was bringing up very warm warm air from lower latitudes. And so that was another way you could keep the ocean from cooling off as much as usual in the wintertime, because it was just the warm air masses all the way along the west coast into Alaska. All right. So is there any precedent for what we've been seeing? Well, kind of yes and no, and I'm going to have a little bit more about that. But here we have seen, periods of colder and warmer water in the Northeast Pacific. The top 2 panels show the other 2 periods that were really warm, but basically 2014 through 2016 was without precedent in terms of the geographic scope of that warming and the intensity of it. All right. So I want to put that a little bit into kind of a climate change context. And here's some work John Walsh and others have done for the kind of Bering Sea and Gulf of Alaska, just looking at, here are these 2 different boxes. These again for 2016, showing the sea surface temperature anomalies. Here are time series going back to 1900 for the Gulf in SST and in heat content. And we just basically haven't seen SSTs like that in the Gulf before. Similar piece of work was done by Mike J. Cox and company for the California current system part of the West Coast. And so this region right in here. And here, the actual sea surface temperature anomalies for that box showing up here. And here's the blob right there, kind of uncharted territory. For what it's worth, this background shows all the climate models that we've been using to kind of look at how that system is going to evolve, and showing that it's kind of at the at the extreme of those. And basically, the baseline warming has made the blob that much more intense than it otherwise would have been. And that if I'm going to skip the next slide because it's kind of complicated and just in the interest of time, but just the idea that if there hadn't been this rise here, the peak intensity of this past event wouldn't have been nearly as large. All right. And just a slide that's a little bit, I think, a little more straightforward to kind of understand and see is here, what are these climate models? And I picked 4 basically at random, are showing for upper ocean temperatures along the Washington coast. Our blob was anomalies 1.5, 2 degrees, something like that. And so what they're showing is that much warming in the mean by about the middle of this century. And so what was an extreme event that we hadn't seen before is going to be more the rule rather than the exception. And then when we get the extreme events in a couple of decades, it's going to be, completely uncharted territory. So very briefly here, could the blob, or was the blob predicted? Well, actually, the models being used right now for seasonal weather prediction in August of 2013 for that winter following had warmer than normal temperatures off our coast, but only about 0.5 degree, 1 degree C above normal versus what was actually observed. Similar pattern, but it was much more intense. This next slide I put in there just in partly because I'm not a very nice guy, and it's completely baffling. Alphabet soup, and I'm not sure how nutritious this soup is, but I'm putting in there the climate community is trying to look at the linkages between the tropical Pacific and the North Pacific and the feedbacks and that sort of thing. We're trying to make progress on understanding the system and predicting it on timescales out a few seasons to a year or so, and making some slow progress, I'd say. So just to sum up, again, we had a marine heat wave of the likes we've never seen before, 2014 through 16. It was only the severity it was because of the baseline warming that we've seen in the system. And then finally, the idea, and this is something that a lot of us are getting much more interested in, and trying to actually make forecasts to see how much we can understand about the system, that there's some hope that we'll have some predictability in the system out as long as a year. So, thank you.
Thank you, Nick. Are there any questions for clarification for Nick's presentation? Yes, Aaron.
Yeah, thank you. Most of your observations, of course, was sea surface temperature, because that's what's really available. Is there any indication how deep in the ocean these effects reach?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, and there, thanks to the Argo profiling float array, I've looked at some of that. Toward the end of the blob, we were seeing heat down to 300 meters below the surface. And so it took a while to get down there, but certainly from the point of view of below the oceanic mix layer, yeah, it was definitely extreme by that measure, and it may have, I don't know what role that played from an ecosystem point of view, but we definitely saw the heat down to as deep as 300 meters. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I knew how to do this just moments ago. I'm having trouble. trouble finding the cursor. Hmm? Assistance required. Sorry, Sam.
No, right.
Okay. It went far away. Thanks, Sam. Next speaker is Brianna Abrams, and she's a research ecologist at NIMS Northwest Fisheries Center, and Brianna will be talking about the California current.
Okay, so today I've been asked to give a background overview from physical oceanography to forage fish in the California current. So I'll talk a lot about upwelling today as an important driver of ecosystem dynamics in the California current. Talk about how upwelling is expected to change under climate change, as well as talk about some other climate-related impacts in the California current, as well as biological effects of the blob. So to begin with some background on upwelling in the California current, coastal upwelling in the California current system is driven by spring and summertime upwelling that is driven by northwest winds. And these winds upwell cold, nutrient-rich water to the surface. Because of the high productivity that's driven by this seasonal upwelling, prey resources in the California current are highly abundant and predictable. And the life cycles of many marine organisms are closely tied to these seasonal processes. As a result, the California current is both highly retentive and attractive to a large suite of top predators. For example, here on the left, let's see. Okay, we have the tracks of a number of different predators, individuals from a variety of species that undergo large basin-scale migrations to the California current system, presumably to take advantage of its abundant and predictable prey resources. And just to illustrate the importance of seasonality to the California current system, on the right we have tracks from 3 predator taxa. And these are the mean latitudinal positions of these species over time. And they're overlaid over the climatological chlorophyll and sea surface temperature cycles. And we can see that there's a persistent north-south migration among these predators that is associated with seasonal changes in productivity and temperature that is reflective of the upwelling cycle. We also know that the intensity, duration, and timing of upwelling in the California current strongly influences the ecosystem. So upwelling in the California current is characterized by a high level of interannual variability. Here we have the spring transition index, which is the date of spring transition to upwelling conditions as a function of time and latitude, and we can see that there's a high degree of variability between years. And here I've just highlighted the El Niño events, which are often associated with delayed upwelling. Significant changes in the timing of upwelling in the California current can have really important impacts on trophic interactions and overall productivity of the system. In particular, delayed upwelling can lead to trophic disruption. So, for example, in 2005, there was extremely delayed upwelling in the California current, and this led to pantrophic disruption from primary production to zooplankton to fish, birds, and mammals. On the other hand, we've seen that earlier spring transition is correlated with higher reproductive success among some predator species, specifically auklets and mures. So this bar chart shows the correlation between the length of the upwelling season based on whether upwelling started earlier in the year and the date of seabird egg lays, as well as their reproductive success. So there is a there's a negative correlation between the length of the upwelling season and seabird lay date. So the longer the season, the earlier the seabird lay date. And there's a positive correlation with reproductive success. And this is thought to be because when there is earlier spring transition, there's higher productivity in the system that's available to birds, which lead to earlier lay dates, and then higher food availability when chicks hatch to provision for the chicks. So we're seeing that the phenology of the upwelling season has major ecosystem impacts. The intensity of upwelling also has important impacts on the biological community, and we can see that there's also a high degree of variability between years in upwelling intensity. To understand the impacts of upwelling intensity on forage assemblages, Santora and colleagues ran a principal components analysis on a suite of physical variables from sampling stations all along the California coast, and they found two distinct upwelling modes. A warm, weak upwelling mode in which upwelling is concentrated in a narrow band near shore, and a strong, cool upwelling mode in which upwelling occurs in a much broader area from the coast to farther offshore. They then correlated that principal component with a number of long-term biological time series, and they found that different forage assemblages were associated with each different upwelling mode. So strong upwelling is associated with a forage assemblage that's predominantly characterized by krill, squid, year of the young rockfishes and flatfishes, as well as additionally regionally spawned forage species. And in contrast, a weak upwelling mode is associated with a forage assemblage that's dominated by species from farther south and farther offshore, like adult northern anchovy and Pacific sardine. And we know that these ecosystem shifts are reflected in the ecology of top predators. For example, Fleming et al. Found that humpback whale diets switch between being dominated by krill versus forage fish, depending on the upwelling mode. So this is a graph kind of a conceptual graph showing humpback whale diets and the upwelling intensity / northern Pacific gyre oscillation. So we can see how integral upwelling is to the California current ecosystem dynamics. And now we can ask, how might we expect coastal upwelling here to respond to climate change? Well, nearly 30 years ago, Bakken suggested that global warming would lead to intensified coastal upwelling by creating greater alongshore wind stress on the ocean surface. He predicted that differences in land and ocean air temperatures would increase and would cause increased cross-shore pressure gradients that drive upwelling favorable winds, leading to upwelling intensification. So to evaluate this hypothesis, we can ask two questions. First, how has coastal upwelling changed in the past? And for this, we can look to a meta-analysis that synthesized results from 128 time series from 5 eastern boundary current systems, of which the California current is one, to examine long-term trends in upwelling favorable winds. Secondly, we can ask, how will coastal upwelling change in the future? And for that, I'll show results from a paper that looked at the upwelling response in an ensemble of global climate models out to the end of the century. So these are the results from the meta-analysis. And the histograms show the number of studies that were consistent or inconsistent with the Bakken hypothesis. In other words, whether the upwelling favorable winds had increasing or decreasing trends in each system. And the different colored bars show different breakdowns in the data, whether the data were year-round or seasonal, whether they were modeled or observed. And the meta-analysis showed that most studies were consistent with the Bakken hypothesis, including in the California current, but with a major caveat that the results were highly dependent on a number of factors listed here. And in particular, most of the studies that did show an increase in upwelling favorable winds were at higher latitudes. The results of the climate projections were generally consistent with the meta-analysis, but they were more nuanced. There was significant variation between the eastern boundary current systems, but most showed, sorry, I'm trying to get my mouse over here, most showed intensification only in the northern, or the poleward portions of the systems. And in fact, a number of them showed weaker upwelling towards the equatorial portion of each system. And so this suggests that eastern boundary current systems may shift poleward into the future. So what might be the biological impacts of such shifts in upwelling? Well, we're likely to see poleward shifts in habitats and oceanic features like the transition zone chlorophyll front, and corresponding shifts in biodiversity that track these habitats and features. And one paper I'll refer you to is Hazen et al.'s Nature Climate Change paper, which looked at shifts in top predator distributions in response to climate change in the North Pacific. We can also expect that there will be more mismatches between predators and prey, both temporally and spatially. But in general, we need to better incorporate the adaptive plasticity of all of these species when trying to really understand potential climate-driven impacts on ecosystem dynamics. There are also a lot of other things to consider when trying to project changes in coastal upwelling ecosystems. And this is just a broad overview, but we anticipate changes in the water column structure, including increased stratification and changes in the nutrient and oxygen content of source waters, such as oxygen depletion and increased hypoxia. And as Nick highlighted, the warm water anomaly can help us predict looking at the warm water anomaly can help predict ecosystem impacts, and this is expected to become more of the norm in the future. So looking back at impacts on forage availability in the blob, I'm going to show results both in changes in abundance and distribution of the forage community. So one of the big impacts that we saw is that higher quality forage species like sardines and anchovies were found in very low abundance during the years of the blob. And they also shifted in distribution farther north and further offshore, which likely contributed to the sharp increase in whale entanglements that I know you'll hear about more on Thursday. On the other hand, medium energy forage species like squid and rockfish were found in very high abundance, especially along the California coast. Krill declined sharply starting in 2014 throughout the California current. And in general, forage was higher in the northern portion of the system than in the southern portion. There were also a number of anomalous events during the blob, including huge harmful algal blooms that led to fishery delays and closures, which Vera will speak about more later. As I mentioned, record entanglements in baleen whales in nearshore fishing gear, which is attributed in part because they followed their forage fish prey further inshore, as I mentioned. And we also saw mass mortalities in a number of other predator species because of poor forage conditions. So just to summarize quickly, I talked about how upwelling in the California current system has huge variability in the timing, duration, and intensity of upwelling, and this has important impacts on predator-prey interactions, reproductive success, and the forage assembly. Predictions on upwelling intensification are equivocal, but there's a consensus around increased intensification towards the poles. Other climate impacts we expect to see are increased stratification, changes in the nutrient content, and decreased oxygen of source waters. And during the blob, we saw lower abundance and more northerly and inshore distribution of high-quality forage species, as well as a number of other anomalous events. So I'll end here and take any questions.
Questions, clarification?
I guess this is sort of obvious, but upwelling is dependent on a continent being there, right? I mean, it's a continental interaction. So as upwellings move south in the southern hemisphere, will they disappear if they're intense to the south?
That's a good question. I don't know, but I would think so.
There's still quite a bit of there's a fair amount of South America still south or poleward of the main kind of upwelling zone right now. So we're not going to run out of room anytime soon. If the whole circulation really contracts toward the poles, maybe you start seeing that. But yeah, good question.
But your premise is right. These are all, this is a characteristic of eastern boundary current systems, so you do need a continent there.
Any other questions for clarification? Okay, let's see if I can manage it. Spain, it's a different Portugal. I keep losing the cursor. Can you try to find it? It's right in there. Ah, okay. We need to press this.
Yeah.
The P, and then you're
That one?
Yeah, and then we just load you up over here.
All right. Good.
And now that he's loaded his own talk, I will introduce Dave Kimmel, who will give us a presentation on the Gulf of Alaska.
And dual service. So thank you to Sue and Samantha for allowing me to speak to you today. I want to talk a little about the Gulf of Alaska ecosystem and lower trophic level trends and dynamics. And for my outline, I'm going to tell you a little about who we are in the Recruitment Processes Alliance at NOAA and what we study in the first year of a fish's life from an ecosystem perspective to give you a sense of the types of data that we collect and what we're doing. I'll give you a little bit of overview of where we sample in the Gulf of Alaska. And the bulk of the talk is I'm going to give a look at trends and a general trophic level overview of oceanography, primary productivity, phytoplankton, zooplankton, and forage fish. And then I'll stop there and tell you a little bit of an ecosystem story concerning Pacific cod, where we can trace ecosystem level effects up to a fish. So this slide just basically shows what we do in the Recruitment Processes Alliance. We are a cross-NOAA line adventure. I would say adventure because it has been that way at times. We have in-situ moorings, we have surveys, we have laboratory data, and our goal is to integrate all of these. And the types of products we produce are things like anomaly time series to look at warming and cooling trends in the large marine ecosystems of Alaska. We develop products like the rapid zooplankton assessment, where we can come right off a vessel and give an indication of what the forage looks like. And we look at things like energetics, the amount of energy in fish, the amount of fat content, the stable isotopes. All of this is integrated together and flows into these reports to the North Pacific Fishery Management Council about ecosystem considerations. What is the ecosystem doing, and should this information be integrated into fisheries management decisions? And so we are giving basically ecosystem-based fisheries management advice. We work all across the Gulf of Alaska. Our core sampling occurs in the western Gulf of Alaska, there near Kodiak Island here. This has been going on for about 40 years, and its relation to the walleye pollock fishery, which is the largest fishery in Alaska. We do a spring and a summer survey to look at larval abundance as well as young of the year abundance. We've since added some work in the eastern Gulf here. We're interested in the same type of ecosystem information there, as well as adding some information about sablefish. And we can also see that we have some whale surveys by our colleagues in Juneau that take place here in Prince William Sound as well as in southeast Alaska. So we cover a broad area in the Gulf of Alaska. So I was asked to give you a little bit of overview about Gulf of Alaska, and I'm going to show this slide to show three major features of the Gulf of Alaska that you should keep in mind. The first is the Alaska Coastal Current. This is a strong coastal current driven by the Aleutian Low and eastward moving winds. And this creates a situation along the coast that's the opposite of what Brianna just told you, as it's mainly a downwelling system. The current bifurcates around Kodiak Island. The Alaska Stream continues along the continental shelf towards the Aleutian Islands, but the Alaska coastal current enters into Bering Sea at Unamak Pass. You see that little arrow there, and continues all the way up through the Bering Strait into the Chukchi Sea. The other two features I want you to see here are the blue arrows. This is indicating the large volume of freshwater input that comes into the Gulf of Alaska. It's roughly 1.5 times the volume of the Mississippi River, so it's a very large amount of fresh water. And this creates some density differences along the coast, and we get a lot of eddies that are forming. And those eddies are important because they serve to trap plankton and other things in these features that help support the productivity that we see in the system. If we move on to looking at the cross-shelf dynamics, now the Alaska coastal current is moving into the screen. You have the coast of Alaska to your right and the open ocean to your left. You see we have Ekman transport coming towards the shore. We get downwelling at the shelf break front, but every once in a while we get a little bit of upwelling, which delivers some nutrients closer to the shore. We get a lot of tidal mixing, and then in the spring we get some freshwater inputs, some nutrients. That heats up, it stratifies, and we get a spring bloom. So there is some productivity going on along the Alaska coast, and I'll show you those dynamics now as I move into some of the trends and dynamics in the system. So for phytoplankton, we don't really have a very good long-term time series. This is derived from some work looking at satellite observations. And you can see that on the left, if you look at the chlorophyll bloom by month, you see that there's a spring bloom roughly around May that dips down a little bit. You see it bloom again a little bit in the fall, and then it drops down precipitously due to light limitation. But most notably, you see in the long-term trend in chlorophyll time series is there doesn't seem to be a very long-term trend. The productivity in terms of chlorophyll biomass in the system has remained relatively the same, at least according to satellites. And it is very cloudy, but I'll show you that you can see these blooms from space. You can also see those eddy features quite clearly along the shelf edges. Though it is pretty cloudy most of the year, but we do get some estimates of chlorophyll from satellite. If we look at primary production, again, we're relying on satellites and an algorithm to convert the chlorophyll biomass along with some other parameters into productivity. And here you see, even though the chlorophyll peaks in May, the actual productivity peak is in the summer, and this is driven primarily by temperature. And more interestingly, you see it looks as though productivity has increased over the last decade or so that we have records. Again, this is a function primarily of temperature and the marine heat wave that we saw in 2014. But I'm going to return to this point when I start to speculate about what might happen to this system in the future. Us at Phys, the Fisheries Oceanography Coordinated Investigations, we've been measuring zooplankton abundances in the Gulf of Alaska for the last 30 years or so. What you're looking at here is our long-term time series for small copepods. They're pictured there on the right. The black dots represent our process data, and the blue represent that rapid zooplankton that we get right off the ship. And what you see is a pretty boring long-term trend. You don't see a lot of variability in small copepods. But when we go to the large, I guess more nutritious copepods, we see an interesting trend, particularly in the last couple of years. So this is a krill on the top here, but these are the large, more lipid-rich copepods that we see, Calanus being a prime example. And as we see in 2013 and 15, during that marine heat wave, we saw a dramatic decrease in the abundance that we observed in the system. What you see from our rapid zooplankton is that the abundances appear to have bounced back a little bit in 2017, but there was quite a drop. And we observed the same exact trend for krill. I would say here that we are looking at this type of krill in the middle here. Is the mouse showing up? No. Anyway, the small krill in the middle there is a juvenile stage for cilia, is the one we can capture with our nets, as opposed to the larger krill that you see there that are actually quite good at escaping nets. So this time series we see here, a lot of variability. Krill go up and down quite a bit. We don't have a huge handle on their variability, but you did see during that marine heat wave, we did see some drops, but those aren't unprecedented in the data set. One of our colleagues downstairs in the Midwater Assessment Group is actively using acoustics to assess krill. And what I wanted to show you here was a couple of things. One is there seems to be some hot spots along the Alaskan coast where we see krill pretty frequently in these spring surveys. We also notice them in our nets, though not as much. And these hotspots are areas where we feel there's aggregations that are very important for feeding and moving of energy up the food web. Also, you can see in their long-term trend, they didn't see as big a decline in 2015 in krill. They're looking at the adults. We were looking at the juveniles. We're still working on ways to rectify these data with each other, but it's very difficult because krill are very good at avoiding nets. If we look at forage fish, I'm looking here on the left at some long-term data that was published in 1999, and then our data for Young of the Year surveys on the right. And what I want you to notice for these three species, walleye pollock is a forage fish only when it's age 0, and then capelin and eulachon are two pretty important forage fish. I want you to notice that round about the late 1980s, capelin essentially disappeared from the ecosystem. And this has been attributed to a shift, a regime shift, related to the Pacific Decadal Oscillation changing from what you saw in Nick's presentation, so that we have shifted over to a groundfish-dominated system from a system that used to be dominated by these forage fish and shrimps. And if our data on the right there that we see bumping up and down of walleye pollock. We have seen some abundances of capelin recently, but again, levels of overall remain low in these forage fishes. So what I want to do now is tell you an ecosystem-based story in 4 slides concerning Pacific cod. And this is a blob-related story. And the story is that last year at the North Pacific Fishery Management Council, it was reported that Pacific cod catches had dropped dramatically in the Gulf of Alaska. So we wanted to know why that might be the case. And so we started to look at our data across the Recruitment Processes Alliance and try to get a sense of what was going on. And so this slide on the right here, I got from a blog about the blob. Let's say that 3 times fast. And this addresses the question earlier to show you that this blob first manifested at the surface, but eventually moved down into the water column over the course of 3 years. And this is shown by our own data on the left. You see the 2013 and 15 surveys that we took showed a pretty warm temperatures at the surface, but they declined at depth. But in 2017, that warm water had mixed very deep into the water column in the coastal Gulf of Alaska. I'll just remind you that the actual large zooplankton that form the main source of food when larval fish transition to the juvenile phase were in low abundance. So this is just the same slide as before. But also, when we looked at the Pacific cod larvae in 2013, it was the highest number we had ever recorded, followed by 2015, which was the lowest number we had ever recorded, which is quite interesting. And Pacific cod, eventually when they reach age, they actually settle out demersally. So we were interested in the summer young of the year. Where were they? And we can pick that up in our summer survey. And you can see in 2013, we saw lots of Pacific cod, but they were very far west in very high numbers, almost near the Unimak Pass. That was somewhat troubling for 2 reasons. One, we don't normally see them that far west. They tend to settle in areas around Kodiak Island where we look and places along the coast of the Alaska Peninsula. The other is we don't usually get very high numbers of Pacific cod in our surveys, so they're usually settled out at that point. So we were able to go to our colleague Ben Laurel, who works out of Newport, and he does a Kodiak Beach seine at a couple sites that are settlement areas for Pacific cod. And he noted that around 2013, there was basically no Pacific cod settling out of this system. And that was coincident with an incredible rise in temperatures that he saw around that time. So we think around that, during this blob period, Pacific cod larvae experienced very high mortalities, either by transport to the west or temperature effects. And this is only part of the story. There's also an adult part of the story that our colleagues in stock assessment, Steve Barbeau and others, have shown that there was a lot of mortality on the year 2 Pacific cod. So working together across our different lines, we can begin to bring these stories into shape. So to summarize, I just want to leave you with the impression that the Gulf of Alaska is a pretty dynamic system. Lots of nearshore downwelling, high freshwater input, strong alongshore current. For the lower trophic level dynamics, we know that things are strongly related to temperature and regional oceanography, but a lot of the aspects are poorly understood. We're desperately trying to figure out more about krill dynamics because that forms almost the dominant prey item for most of our juvenile fish in the system before they overwinter. We don't see a lot of trends, even though we've been looking at these data for about 30 years across lower trophic levels, except with the indication that primary production may be increasing, and I'll talk about that here. With respect to the blob, maybe the blob is a glimpse into the future, as we've heard in the other two talks. The overall trophic level abundance has declined during the blob. We saw lots of lower copepod and zooplankton, but it's since rebounded. And those effects were able to be seen all the way up to juvenile fish, and I'm sure at higher trophic levels. But this ecosystem sensitivity to warming suggests some hypothesis. First of all, the change in phenology and biomass and productivity. We're pretty sure we're seeing that productivity peak move forward in time. We see higher primary productivity, and this has been predicted for lots of high-latitude systems, but those phytoplankton will be smaller in size. And as a result, they tend to result in longer food webs, a more active microbial loop, and less accumulation of lipids up the food web. So I'll stop there, and I did want to say to this crowd of charismatic megafauna folks that invertebrates are 97% of animal diversity, and I'm here to represent. So thank you very much.
First, any questions for Dave for clarification?
Any questions for me for clarification? Yes.
Oh, is it on? Well, I guess representing the marine megafauna. My question was...
Scott, could you give your name and affiliation, please?
Yes, Scott Baker, Oregon State University, representing marine megafauna. My question was there any evidence of predation influencing particularly the forage fish?
Not that I'm aware of. I haven't seen any information to suggest that prey on the forage is causing this type of changes, but I'm not an expert on that. So I go up to zooplankton, and that's basically it. But Sue said I had to have a slide about forage fish, so there you go.
Any other quick ones?
Yeah, just a quick question. You mentioned the lipid analysis. Have you actually seen reduction in the sort of per volume lipid composition rather than just smaller krill that would thus have less lipids?
So we're currently looking in that mostly in the Bering Sea. We see a lot of regional variability in the total amount of lipids, and so we're looking at also that in the Arctic, and we have seen differences spatially in the total amount of lipid. We're very excited about this year because it's it's a bad thing. It's the lowest amount of ice ever recorded in the Bering Sea, and so when we're up doing our surveys, we're going to get indications as to whether that's impacted the total lipid volume itself. But we don't have any long-term trends on that. I am interested in long-term trends in size of zooplankton and whether or not that's changed, and so I'll be interested to look at that as a measure of total productivity. Yep.
Yeah, I was wondering, are you able to make any comments about the long-term pH measurements or anything related to ocean acidification for this region?
Yeah, so we're actually meeting on Thursday to talk a little bit more about ocean acidification. There's been some work looking at Limacina, which is one of the dominant pteropods in the system, but we haven't seen any major effects of OA on any of the prey items that we see. Again, those studies are probably in their infancy, and most of those effects you can see in laboratory studies. The shell gets deformed when you increase the pH, or decrease the pH, but when you're in the actual environment, we haven't seen any effects, any trends. And I've looked at the pteropod data as well. So.
Well, you've just heard three pretty complete and dense presentations, and so I'd like to open it up first to the front table for more broadly discussive questions. Anybody? Francis?
Thank you all for those presentations. That's great. One thing I've been wondering about is the changes in freshwater runoff in California during the blob period because of the changes in snowpack and management of water in California. So one, just sort of what do we know about freshwater runoff changes?
Yeah, my understanding is that they tend to be pretty minimal and not an important part of the system. And maybe Brianna, can add to that. I know in the Sacramento River Delta locally, it's a big deal there, but in terms of there's just not the same amount of water coming out of that system that there is in, to the Columbia River or especially the Gulf of Alaska. But I'll defer to.
Yeah, I would second that. There hasn't been a ton of research attention devoted to that, but I would imagine that would have more of an impact, for example, for salmon. But I think that compared to, for example, upwelling dynamics, that's such a it's a relatively minor effect compared to changes in upwelling.
Robert.
Yeah, thanks to all of you for your presentations. You did a good job of showing the variability in the system, but also showed a lot of data that makes it feasible to make predictions of what the future is going to hold. And I think that all of that is obviously what science is striving for. But I also have concerns about when predictions are being made and how decision makers use those. And so maybe first for Nick, and if Brianna or David, you would like to comment as well, be great. But Nick, you said that the future likely holds more blobs. My paraphrase, of course. What's your confidence in that?
Oh, yeah, I'm confident there's still going to be the kind of variations that we've seen in that system from kind of year to year and decade to decade. And I guess I was a little bit maybe flippant there, the idea that just with the continued warming of the system, that those events relative to historical norms are going to be that much more intense and frequent. And so what would have in the past taken a very intense event is just kind of a moderate one. We'll get to the threshold where suddenly you have more subtropical, zooplankton than boreal ones and so forth. And a big question that we haven't really resolved yet is the kind of nature of the variability itself. And I'm not sure if that's what you were asking about in part, at least, whether there's the variability about that baseline, whether that's going to increase or decrease or not. And that's kind of an open question in my mind.
Comments from you guys?
Yeah, I try not to make wildly optimistic or pessimistic predictions. What I try to do is we're really interested in the mechanisms that underlie the ecology that we observe. And for example, a lot of the predictions concerning size, metabolic rate, and things are things that we can be fairly confident that are mechanistically based. As far as wide-scale distributions of organisms, I'm very cautious when I do that because there's a lot of papers that say when things warm, things will move north or south, and they often exclude evolution. And especially in the plankton, that evolution is very important to the adaptability of these systems. So I think there's a lot of surprises out there, so I try to stay away from that particular point. But yeah, I think when we're studying mechanisms, we can be a little bit more, guarded, or at least have some capability to make predictions. But distributions, who knows?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And yeah, another thing that we also haven't really talked about that maybe more of the marine mammal people will talk about is just how behavior comes into play here for megafauna. And so when you have certain individuals that have extremely high fidelity to certain foraging regions in the ocean, you might not see the shifts that some people are expecting to have. And so, yeah, there are a lot of other components besides shifts in the oceanography that we're expecting.
Peter.
Yeah, I'm just struck, obviously these are ocean basin scale effects you're describing. If you talk about, sort of more a comment as you talk about Gulf of Alaska and freshwater flows, there are places where you may get more localized effects, but then you're worried that the cod are moving to a local area which may allow them to escape or not stay in the system. And I guess the point about marine mammal behavior is kind of the same thing. It's kind of a local, I mean, marine mammals themselves are a locality that shifts in response to this. I don't know. I guess I'm asking, is there anywhere where local scale processes overcome this blob scale process we're describing?
I think undoubtedly that's the case. I think we see a lot of, especially in the Gulf of Alaska, we see a lot of local scale processes, so much so that it's been difficult for us to get a grasp on the ecosystem to the extent that we do in the Bering Sea, where we have a feature like ice that structures the ecosystem very strongly. We see these warm and cold stanzas, and we have a very nice ecosystem story for there. Whereas in the Gulf, we see lots of these localized processes like eddies and things that may make the difference between a hot spot of trophic transfer in one year and the lack of one in another. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I was struck by that in Brianna's presentation too, about the scale of response, and that's something that we struggle with obviously all the time. Other questions from, Sam?
Thanks. I was just wanting to focus on oxygen for a second. Brianna mentioned it in terms of future predictions, decreased oxygen, and obviously it's connected to temperature as well. But are we making good observations of that we'll be able to integrate that into these lower trophic level impacts? Obviously not important for air-breathing marine mammals, but for the invertebrates, that's a key component of the ecosystem. So are we making those observations, and we'll be able to incorporate that in the predictions?
Yes, we're definitely measuring oxygen. My experience with oxygen has mostly been before I came here, I worked a lot in the Gulf of Mexico looking at the distributions of zooplankton in response to hypoxic waters, also in Chesapeake Bay. And it does make a difference how much of the water column is hypoxic before you start to see behavioral changes. But yeah, I think we're making those measurements, and I think we're in Alaska, it's less of an issue that I've observed simply because the water is so cold. We typically see a fair bit of oxygen penetrating to deep layers. But as the water's warm, it will be a significant issue, and people have been looking at how ecosystems respond to oxygen from the movements of zooplankton for quite some time. So we do have a good, at least working hypotheses on how that works.
Yeah, and I believe in the California current that's also being measured. I don't know if anyone here is involved in the Cal Coffee program, but I believe those are being measured as part of that.
Yeah, and just in this neck of the woods, especially Dick Feely's group, that the OA, as part of that monitoring regular cruises, they're taking those sort of measurements, and there's the oxygen concentrations are kind of part and parcel with the PCO2 in the water and the aragonite subsaturation and so forth. And so maybe not as good as monitoring as Cal Coffee, which is kind of the industry standard, but we're keeping track of it.
Any other questions from the front before we open it? Dennis?
So as you know, we're talking about southern resident killer whales tomorrow. And they are Chinook salmon and other salmon in the winter, and other fishes besides salmon are extremely important to them. And I'm wondering if any of you feel comfortable talking about the shifts and changes you've talked about and what effects those have had on Chinook salmon and other species that killer whales are dependent on.
Yeah, I'll just start on that. In terms of the freshwater habitat, of course, that's a big deal for the salmon and the trout and other endangered species. And so we are seeing some rises in temperatures in some of the area streams with the lack of snowpack going into the summer. Changes in the timing of the low water that with higher temperatures and lower oxygen levels. And there's some real concerns that in a lot of the freshwater habitat in the Pacific Northwest, that it's going to transition from a kind of more snow-dominated streams right now to a more rain-dominated
sort of hydrograph and seasonality. And so that's definitely a concern. And but exactly how fast that transition is going to happen, that's still to be settled.
So salmon are quite complex in terms of all the things that go into their their biology. But obviously, in the ocean, the long-term productivity that we see at the ecosystem level can indeed impact the salmon. But I think locally, a lot of the issues are more human-related, dams and the management of the fishery at the local level, and that's not a lot of what we do at the Alaska Fisheries Science Center in our particular group. So that's about the extent that I can comment on that.
I think similarly, this is pretty far outside of my area of expertise, but a resource for the California Current that I definitely would recommend is the California Current Integrative Ecosystem Assessment Project, CCIEA. They, I know, have every single year relate a number of different biological time series, including salmon, to oceanographic and climate variables, and they have presentations online that you can look up from every single year, and so I recommend checking that out.
So we're down to just under 3 minutes, so I would like to open it up to questions from the audience. Anyone from the group? No? Well, if not, I'll take the opportunity then to sort of put Nick a little on the spot, because he works right down the hall from me, and he'd be disappointed if I didn't. So we are talking now more and more in the ocean observing world about seabirds, marine mammals, upper trophic level species, being able to perhaps give indices that things are going on in the ocean that might be missed. And I'm wondering, with regard especially to the workshop that you helped to chair at UW when the blob was just kind of ongoing, do you envision, or perhaps is it happening now, that there's good communication in terms of when they're seeing emaciated, sea lions and Channel Island, that sort of thing? Can we close this communication loop a little bit better, be more effective?
That dialogue has been obviously going for a while, but I think it is increasing, and especially this event, the blob, kind of galvanized those sorts of conversations, and hopefully won't have to wait for another one, that they won't wither away until the next one happens and so forth. But I think there's a lot of interest in both the climate community and the fisheries community to keep those that cross-pollination going, to kind of mix a metaphor there. So I'm hopeful we're going to make progress.
And I didn't know if either of you wanted to comment on that. I mean, obviously your presentations show really, I think, good communication and integration, but are there places where we could be doing a better job in that regard?
Always. I think communication there's only so many hours in the day, and I think we all can do a better job communicating across different disciplines and things of that nature. It's been a little easier as an oceanographer. We've always had to work with lots of different people. But I think, when these events happen, as Nick said, it drives us together to talk about these things. But yeah, can we do a better job? Absolutely.
Peter?
I'm just curious, what are the relative timescales from oceanographer to marine mammal biologist in terms of observing these events? If you say you want to communicate, well, if you only hear about it 3 years later, that may not be that much use to someone who's got a satellite image they can read immediately.
Right, that really is always the the struggle, is the scale of the event and our response time and things like that. But I too am hopeful that I think we're seeing a lot more cross-pollination at oceanographic meetings, at various science venues, where people that usually did not cross disciplines very much are at least starting to do that more frequently. And we are down to 10 seconds, so yes. Yep.
I've got a question from the webinar, and it might be better answered later, so you can defer as the moderator, but this is from Gay Sheffield. What is the prediction for the Bering Sea regarding harmful algal blooms?
I think we will defer that. Gay and I have discussed that quite a bit, but since we didn't really cover the Bering Sea very much in this session, I will certainly get back to Gay and ask for help from my speakers. But first, I'd like you to help me thank the speakers. I think they did a great job. I also want to remind you to come back for the afternoon session, which starts at 1:30, and it is on ecosystem impacts. So we're going to be sort of going upwards in the trophic level of things and talking about ocean acidification and things like that. So please come back after lunch, and thanks for your attention.